everyone. My name is Elizabeth VLOSSAK. I'm an associate professor at Brock University in St. Catharines, which is, if you just follow Lake Ontario all the way to Niagara Falls, it's right there. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing as well as commentating on this panel entitled, very evocatively, In Someone Else's Land? Question mark. In Someone Else's Land? Post-war France, Germany, and the spaces in between. Our first panelist today is Dr. Alison Carrol from Brunel University in London. She is a lecturer in European history. She has published extensively on Alsace, the borderlands of Alsace-Lorraine, on the SFIO in Alsace, and recently a chapter in a collected volume, the chapter entitled The 1924 Strasbourg Colonial Exhibition. She will be talking today about building the border between France and Germany, 1871 to 1914.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so this paper is about the construction of the border between France and Germany after 1871, when the border region of Alsace and much of Lorraine transferred from French to German rule, and up to the outbreak of war in 1914. It's very nice of Liz to mention my publications, but most of them are on a later period. So most of them are from the period after 1918. And this project began, well, it's not a freestanding project, but it began as a way of thinking about how and why return proved so difficult after 1918. But as I looked at it, I increasingly began to think about how much this period tells us about the role of grassroots participation in the construction of borders. And so that's the kind of key question of this paper. It's how, through their actions and through their expectations, the populations living on both sides of the border made it a meaningful division. So how they helped construct it and how they helped to sustain it in the years after 1871. So borders, as we're all aware, are made of more than border posts and crossing guards. And I'd like to try and think about the border as a collective construction that was redrawn following a particular moment of conflict against the backdrop of high politics of nation building and built through a range of actions and a range of actors. So I'll start with some brief thoughts on borders, and then I'll talk through some examples of the investment of symbolism, crossings, transgressions, and rumours, and how through these means a sense of difference was created and sustained. So much of the literature on border regions opens with the fact that borders are sites of, on the one hand, they're a limit between two nations, and on the other hand, they're a site of contact between two neighbouring populations. So the populations live with the border posts and the crossing guards that offer a reminder that they're living at the limits of the national territory. But they're also frequently connected to neighbouring populations through culture, through language, or through family ties. And this was the case in Alsace. The region formed the physical boundary between France and Germany, and fortifications offered a reminder of this, but at the same time it was linked to both France and Germany through politics, the economy, culture, and society. And the local population used both these ideas of the region as a boundary and the idea of the region as a site of contact when they talked about where they lived and talked about the surrounding region. So sometimes they would refer to the limits of either France or Germany. The Rhine as France's natural and historic frontier, going back to the days of Gaul, or as Germany's mythic river, uniting the German lands. But at other times they talked about the region connecting the two nations as a bridge across the Rhine, and the Rhine as a European river, with Alsace as the heart of these broader European connections. And this idea of the bridge across the Rhine achieved particular currency in the period that I'll be talking about after 1871, because during this period it offered a means to argue for continued connections to France without overtly rejecting German rule. After 1918, which is the period that I've worked more closely on, it took on a slightly different character. And then it was something that was used to argue for the retention of regional particularities within the centralising French state. Now, all the same, while it's important to recognise that the border was a site of both contact and the limits, it's also important not to overstate either point. So the border was transgressed in many ways during the period that I'm talking about today, and in the later period through smuggling, through illegal crossings, a range of transgressions. And while it was a site of contact, Alsatian dialect was sufficiently different from German for it to be used as a tool of resistance after 1871. And ideas of Alsace sharing a political culture with France were tested during this period, and particularly would be tested after 1918. So what all of this reminds us is that the meaning of the border didn't stay static. So we're familiar with the fact that the physical border and the territorial limits moved, but it's important to remember that the meaning invested in it also changed. And so this is the context to the development of the border and the grassroots participation that I'll be talking about today. So this is a story that begins with the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871 and France's defeat. The Treaty of Frankfurt that followed it granted most of Alsace and a section of Lorraine to the new German Empire. A Franco-German commission was charged with fixing the exact limits of the border, although as a result of its defeat, France didn't have very much say in this. And Francois Roth talks about the new border as something that France accepted but never really recognised. Essentially, the border moved from the Rhine River to the Vosges Mountains. And the debate triggered a well-known, the transfer triggered a well-known debate about citizenship, as annexation was justified on the fact that the population shared a language, an ethnicity, and a culture with German populations. So that was the justification in Germany, while in France the argument was that the Alsatians had opted to be French, that they had chosen to be French at the Revolution and they had protested annexation. So the classic juxtaposition of the civic, ethnic, German and French ideas of nationhood have developed in interaction with each other and in opposition to each other over the annexation of Alsace. And Lorraine, sorry. Lorraine's also in this paper, but most of my publications have just been about Alsace, so I have to keep remembering to mention it. And so the new border quickly acquired its own symbolism. The blue line of the Vosges offered a reminder of the new frontier, and it was associated with the cult of Alsace-Lorraine that developed after 1871. So this cult came to form part of the symbolism of the Third Republic. So as the regime's leaders drew upon the Marseillaise and the 14th of July and the tricolour flag, cultural representations of Alsace-Lorraine also formed part of this new culture. And these images that are up on the screen are part of this cult that develops. So the painting that's on your left, à l'attente, depicts the region patiently waiting for its return to France. And Liz has talked a lot about the gendered dimensions of this image and the gendered representations of Alsace-Lorraine in this cult that developed around the Lost Provinces. It was a symbolism that came very much from the centre. It's very much a French cult, but at the same time it was also developed in the periphery, and this developed in interaction with France. So the image on your right is one of the caricatures of Hansi, who is an Alsatian caricaturist, who similarly stressed and depicted the loyalty and devotions of the Lost Provinces to France. But in this symbolism, so this is very much symbolism as a borderland, but the border also featured in the symbolism. So maps depicted the line separating the Lost Provinces from France in black or purple, the colours of mourning. And the idea of the Rhine as France's natural and historic frontier and essential to the harmony of the hexagon also became an argument against annexation. And the border increasingly became talked about as a sign of separation, and particularly amongst families who'd been split by it, as certain members of their family had opted to retain French citizenship. So this was the symbolism generated by the new border. But as we think about how people lived alongside it and how they adapted to the presence of a new border in the Vosges, but also the absence of a border between Alsace and Baden and the Rhineland. In terms of eastward connections, memoirs describe continuity rather than any change in habits. Under the Second French Empire, the border between France and Germany had been relatively open, and memoirs from the period talk about leaving Strasbourg for Kiel or leaving Mulhouse for the Black Forest for a Sunday day trip, and describe these passages and practices. So it's rather in their experiences of heading west and to France that sources point to a difference. And the Alsatian authors Alfred Wahl and Jean-Claude Richet talk about people beginning to cross just so that they can feel French soil. Now, it's also at this stage that Alsatians and Lorrainers began to talk about France de l'intérieur. This is quite a kind of interesting phrase, and it continues in the interwar years, so even after the return to France, it's a phrase that's still used. But I think it speaks to the sense of difference and separation that emerged at this point in 1871. Just as the border between the Second French Empire and the German states had been crossed relatively easily, so this new border between France and Germany was also one that could be crossed fairly easily. Although police reports describe crossers' complaints about border guards on both sides being overly aggressive in their questioning or searching the pockets or hats of border crossers. And both French and German citizens appealed to their own governments with complaints about the border guards. And their petitioning questioned the value and the necessity of the border, but also through demanding better border processes, it was also something that helped to kind of contribute the border by stressing that this needed to be reinforced. Now, although the border was fairly easy to cross, people still crossed illegally. And they did so for a range of reasons. It might be to visit family, it might be to see France and touch French soil. And the memoirs of the Alsatian regionalist painter Charles Spindler describe borrowing a friend's passport and crossing by bicycle just to have an adventure. But a major reason for illegal crossing was economic, and the border created new industries and smuggling. French police reports also tell stories of French citizens arrested when chopping wood, hunting, foraging for mushrooms, or fishing on the German side of the border. Now, the report on Monsieur Bellard, who was shot when caught hunting on German territory, notes that he said he didn't realise that he'd crossed the border. But the border guard notes, there's absolutely no way this could be the case, as the boundary was clearly marked. And these transgressions are suggestive of interactions and cross-border encounters, and it's likely that there's many more than the ones that the police recorded, as they only recorded those that were caught. But at the same time, it's through these transgressions that the border acquires meaning in the eyes of the region's inhabitants. As by making a trip that you've taken for a long time a transgression, it kind of contributes to creating a sense of difference and opposition between French and Alsatians or Lorrainers. In other cases, individuals were tricked and pulled over, and these stories frequently made the national press in Paris and Berlin. So in one example, Monsieur Binder, a cafe owner from the border town of Drumont, was asked by a customs guard dressed in plain clothes to sell him some cigars. When he did so, the guard and a colleague pulled Binder over, arrested him on French territory, and fined him 50 marks. In another case, the German police spotted an Alsatian named Schwarz, who was wanted in Germany, but now working in a French hotel in Schlucht. On seeing him, they pulled him across the border, and there was an article about this in the Parisian press that said that several French tourists were present and tried to stop them pulling him over. They did so unsuccessfully. Through these stories, an idea of the frontier as wild and unsafe started to circulate. In reality, these instances were actually fairly rare, but it contributed to a distinction between borderland and the centre. Other people didn't cross the border. Instead, they treated it as a focal point for demonstrations. So, for example, on the 14th of July, Alsatians and Lorrainers would head to significant points on the border to demonstrate. Others destroyed its symbols. Police reports from 1886 describe the case of damage to a border post in Avricourt, the removal of a post at Odin, and a report from 1890 describes the switching of the signposts at Bonhomme, so that the sign that should point to Germany was now pointing to France, and vice versa. The border also became a tourist destination, especially at its more scenic points in the Vosges. And these are images of the postcard industry that this border tourism generated. So we have the image on your left is of Alsace-Lorraine, the twin sisters, France's lost provinces associated with the border. And the one on your right shows French and German officials standing beside the border. I've been trying to work out what I think about this. I think a lot of the images to do with this cult of Alsace-Lorraine are really interesting and gives lots to think about. I've been trying to think whether this suggests the appropriation and adoption of national symbolism. I'm not completely sure, but one of the things that I've noticed in the period after 1918 is that there's different languages that people can adopt. And so they will occasionally adopt national language. Occasionally they'll adopt different languages to talk about the boundary. And I think that this symbolism might be something similar, that national symbolism is one of a range of symbols and one of a range of depictions of the border that people could and did adopt. And this border tourism really took off. So many tourists visited this border post at Schlucht that the French Alpine Club actually protested about the damage to the environment that they were causing because it became such a major site. Elsewhere, as a crux point between the two nations, existing tensions were played out slightly differently at the periphery. So, for example, the Morocco crisis of 1906 looked very different from the border. While the French border police reported no indication of hostility on the German side, they nevertheless reported rumours spreading through the border towns of the Vosges that reservists had been arriving in garrisons in Alsace-Lorraine, that the German authorities had been requisitioning horses and cars, and that the orders for horseshoes placed by Germany in February 1906 were 3 times that of a normal order. The local press added to this concern with reports that the German General Staff had sent officers to survey the frontier, and as the border had divided friends and family, friends living on the German side added to this rumour mill by reporting that young men in Strasbourg had received letters telling them what to do in cases of mobilisation. So the border population was keeping an eye on the international situation, but these international issues were filtered through local concerns and understood in terms of their impact on the locality, and of course felt particularly keenly because of the presence of the frontier. Now, the final example that I have is one of outright confrontation, and this was in 1901 in the Lorraine town of Arneville, and 2 neighbouring villages came together to celebrate the Patronal Fête, which had traditionally been held on the French side of the town. The fight broke out when one of the young men from the French side called to get the attention of one of his friends and shouted "Lucien." The population from the German side thought that he had shouted "Prussien," and this turned into quite a severe confrontation. People ended up being cut with knives, and this descended into chaos. Now, in his notes about this, the commissaire spécial says that he thinks that this was a pretext, that this was something that the German side had created to excuse their behaviour at the festival. But I think that that's just as interesting, whether it was a pretext or whether it's something they were actually using. This is an example of the use of national language to express a sense of difference, whether it's a pretext or whether it's something that they genuinely believed. It's suggestive of the fact that borders don't create a sense of difference by isolating populations, but instead by generating frictions. And this is something I've been thinking about in terms of its implications for the period after 1918, as it suggests that it wasn't simply separation from France that made relations and return difficult, which is what I've always written. It was also that increased contact created a greater sense of difference amongst the two border populations, and that this contributed to the difficulties of return after 1918. And this is something that persists after 1918, but in the opposite direction, as Alsatians had, through their contact with Germany, had developed a very clear sense of their difference from German populations, but they then struggled to convey this to the French government. So these were difficulties that persisted just in another way after 1918. So this involvement in making the border and the border's transfers contributed to the emergence of a clear sense of Alsatian distinctiveness, and national instability, in this case, contributed to a strengthening of existing structures like the family, the church, the community or political parties. So, to draw this together very briefly into conclusions, this is kind of thoughts, examples from the sources, something that I'm thinking about, that I started to look at as context, but I've realised is actually much more important. I think with the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871, Alsace and Lorraine became Germany's western borderland and France's lost frontier. Border residents adapted to these geopolitical changes, and the border became part of daily life, whether as something transgressed or as something whose symbolism was recognised, destroyed, or appropriated. I've talked about this border symbolism that was generated in Paris, in Berlin, in Alsace. But the examples of transgressions and confrontations also suggest that the border was the product of the people who lived there, which comes back to the question that I posed at the beginning about the issue of the construction of borders at grassroots. Our work on national integration in France has stressed very, very persuasively that we have to look at the periphery as well as the centre, that new policies and identities are not simply crafted centrally and then disseminated outwards, that they take shape in significant ways along the frontier. And this example alerts us to how we think about how this process takes place. It alerts us to the importance of cross-border interactions in this process, but also to the importance of the fact that borders are the limits of the national territory and how this is understood and expressed at the frontier. So on the two sides of the border between France and Germany after 1871, the populations developed a sense of difference, partly through their interactions, partly through their separation. And this grassroots involvement sustained the border and maintained this sense of distinction even after the border moved east to the Rhine after 1918, and they once again found themselves members of the same state. Thank you.